Hello to everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Today we're going to get into unit number 2 on the West in the Gilded Age. But before we get there, I want to deal with the phrase, the Gilded Age. All of our first 5 chapters, I think it's the first 5 chapters, deal with the Gilded Age. It's the period roughly between 1865, the end of the Civil War, and approximately 1900. There's a more hard and fast beginning to the Gilded Age. These are just labels that historians use to kind of organize. It's like baskets. They put everything in. The Gilded Age is a basket. But some baskets, some titles aren't as neat and clean. And so the Gilded Age, there's no exact date on when it ended. Around 1900. So when we get to the Progressive Era, the next label and basket, the start of it is somewhat unclear as well, because the Gilded Age, and Progressive Era kind of overlap at some point. But we need not be exact on these things, because these are just, another way for historians to sort of simplify things. The way the human mind works, we have to kind of organize it, put things in neat little boxes and labels on them. Otherwise, we don't understand and we don't remember. So historians divide history into periods, sometimes with fancy names like this one, fancy being the key word here, a pun. Because what does gilded mean? A guild with a U, G-U-I, L-D, was an institution in Europe, and with similar institutions in other places, that was sort of like a union in the Middle Ages, hundreds of years ago. But I don't want to get into it. But that's not what gilded means here. Gilded means, in a more specific sense, it means gold layered, layered in gold. There's kind of a more general meaning, which is sometimes attached to it and used today, which means anything that's like heavily ornamented, fancy, decorated, which would be true of something that's gold-plated, but it could be true of anything that's kind of gaudy and maybe overdone could be seen as gilded. Mark Twain, as you see on the screen here, a great writer from this period, one of America's great literary figures, wrote a story, a piece of fiction with this title. And he used the title to make the point that historians make with it, hence the reason that historians call this the Gilded Age. Again, 1865 to around 1900. So why in the heck would historians call an entire period of approximately 50 years of American history the gold-plated age? What does it have to do with anything? Well, it's a metaphor. I'm not talking about anything actually gold-plated. What Twain is saying, and what historians have tended to accept, though it might not be much of an insightful point, because this could be said about any era. Nonetheless, it might be extra true about this time period after the Civil War, and that is that America looked really good on the surface. Right? There's gold layering around the surface. It's gold-plated. But if you dig just beneath that or whatever, it's not quite as valuable. It doesn't look quite as pretty if you sort of take away the golden veneer on top. So he's making the point that, if you look, there's lots of fortunes being made in the Gilded Age, lots of huge mansions and successful businesses and high-rise buildings going up, great increases in the economy, technology, standard of living for many, but not for everyone. So another way to say this would be, for John D. Rockefeller, who we'll talk about in the next unit, America's first billionaire ever, the Gilded Age not only probably seemed gold-plated, it probably seemed solid gold to him, because he was fabulously wealthy. But to a Jewish or Italian immigrant living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in a tenement building without, sanitation or good sanitation, running water, not much ventilation, tenement buildings were horrible, as we'll also see in another unit. Life didn't look quite so golden, or even gold-plated. So Mark Twain, as great writers are so prone to doing, kind of put his pulse on the wrist of American society at the time, and was able to see things that not everyone could see. So our unit here, which is taking place during the Gilded Age, as was our last one on Reconstruction, and as will be the next ones that follow, the unit on the city in the Gilded Age, our look at business and politics, smokestack nation, really in the Gilded Age, and the unit following that called Dissent, Depression, and War doesn't have Gilded Age in the title, but we're still in that period. That sounds like a lot of units to devote to one small period, but keep in mind, we're not dealing with really any more than 150 or so years in this class, even less, actually. So think of a third of the class being the Gilded Age, about 5 units. The next 5 units being roughly 1900 to 1950, so half the century. And the next 5 units after that being the post-World War II era. And we're not going to get much past the turn of the 21st century. So 50, 50, and 50 actually, this means that the Gilded Age is getting no more representation than it should, given the time span of our class. Conquest and empire in the West, which is another way to say that the United States government and military got extremely aggressive. Not that that was anything new with regard to Native Americans and taking their land and fighting them for that land. Professor Rourke, our author, says, far from being an antidote to the meretricious values of the East, an innocent idol out of place and time, the American West, with its get-rich-quick ethos and its addiction to gambling and speculation, helped set the tone for the Gilded Age. I think I like this quote because it gets us to something that's, I think, easily not seen. Of all the units that we do in the Gilded Age, I think it's this one that probably seems like it has least in common with sort of the things we usually know more about happening in this period, like the rise of big business and the rise of the railroad industry, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, those kind of things. But as we'll see, there's a big overlap here because the get-rich-quick ethos, which was essential or an essential feature of capitalism at the time, industrial capitalism, was alive and well, if well is what you can call it, in the West. So gambling, speculation, land speculation, which means wheeling and dealing, buying and selling in land, flipping, homes, or flipping pieces of land. So all this stuff was going on and more, as we'll see. So the West has much more in common with what's happening on Wall Street than it might appear. East meets West. Theodore Roosevelt as cowboy? That is Theodore Roosevelt right there as a young man. But he actually did a stint in the West in Wyoming. Was it at Wyoming? I think it was Wyoming. Maybe the Dakotas as well. He went out to visit, and he loved it so much he just wrote his wife, "I'm gonna hang out here for a while," and she was okay with it. And he came back. I think a number of times. His first wife died eventually, but he was already a young New York state assemblyman, a politician on the rise when he did this. He wanted to be a cowboy, try his hand at cattle ranching. And he was from an old money East Coast blue blood family. Meaning he came from one of those families that are kind of like the American equivalents of nobility. Money is handed down from generation to generation. They're kind of the upper crust, the elites in New York City, which is where he was born and basically raised there and outside of New York City. Why would this rich kid go and hang out in the West for so long and be a cowboy? It wasn't that long, but it was a year or two. I forget the exact date. And this, I think, makes a fitting symbol of the connection between East and West. the two regions here. Like I said in the last slide, it's very easy to sort of not see any commonality at all between the move west, cowboys and Indians and fighting each other and gunfights, the OK Corral, and how does that have anything to do with what's happening in New York City? One thing is for sure, that Roosevelt is a great example of, as it says on the screen, the enduring allure of the West. Right? And by enduring, I mean up until now. People are constantly kind of romanticize the West of our country, right here in good old California, especially. They sometimes have these fantastic people that haven't been here before. If you ever met anybody, like you were on vacation somewhere else or other part of the country or another part of the world, when they learn you're from California, people have these fantastic ideas about what California is all about. They tend to think it's all beach and surfers or Hollywood stars. It's like, no, there's actually lots of farms and rural areas, and no, there's not. Yeah, there is. But there's always been kind of a romance in the West, and even Theodore Roosevelt, this guy who kind of had it made already, with a family fortune and a career kind of cut out for him. He was also good at politics as well. Graduated from Harvard, etc. Wrote many books. So an accomplished person, but all the more, I think, interesting that he would come to the West. So even a guy like this, maybe the last person you might expect to want to come out west and get dirty and herd cattle, and but this was alluring. He said in a letter, I think, to his wife, "I feel as absolutely free as a man could feel." So his spirit, his personality, I think, as we'll see in later units, actually fits pretty well with the West, even though he was an East Coast guy, born and raised. So the connection between the two regions is there in a number of ways, but partially the spirit of enterprise with the Industrial Revolution in full bloom during this period. This is the period, the Gilded Age, when America transforms itself into a leading power in the world economically, politically, and then eventually, not too long thereafter, militarily. This is it right here. But the West's pull even lured lots of not just rich guys, but lots of rich, wealthy businesses, corporations, railroads that go through their mining companies, etc., as we will see. One of the problems with teaching the West, I've found over the years, this is true of some other units too, is that there's a great deal of myth and romanticization of the West, particularly in movies and TV shows. The Western never seems to die in its popularity. So in popular culture, we see familiar images of the West in our culture, movies, advertising, etc. But as one of the great experts on the history of the West said in a book, classic of the history of the West, she said the West was more about lawsuits than gunfights. So what did Professor Limerick mean? She wasn't denying that gunfights happened. The gunfight at the OK Corral, which is depicted in the movie pictured on the left, did happen. Not quite the way the movies depict it, but okay, the characters were all real people, and so forth. But you're saying as much as that kind of stuff happened from time to time, and we'll see, there were places and moments when the West kind of lived up to its public or popular culture image, but most of the time was much more mundane than that. So hence her rather, I think, clever and apt phrase, the West was more about lawsuits than gunfights. Right? Courtroom drama can certainly be interesting. We have plenty of movies and TV shows about that as well. But lawsuits can also be mundane. Unless there's a big issue and sort of it's a courtroom scene and gifted attorneys making sort of great grandstanding speeches, it can be dull. Especially if you're working out sort of contracts and disputes, civil disputes, not criminal ones, over and this is the big thing. That's what she's alluding to here in the West is most of the lawsuits were about resources, rights to land, rights to water, rights to minerals under the ground, gold, silver, and coal, and so forth. So that already shows us, or gets us right back to the idea that corporate America, big business, was every bit as much alive in the West as it was in the East. But these kind of TV movie images don't help us get there. So, well, teaching the West, as I started by saying when I got to this slide, is to me more difficult than some other units because there's this sort of thick layer of myth and romanticization. And those myths, in stories and movies are sometimes interesting. But when trying to come to grips with the reality of the West, it kind of gets in the way. So there's a greater degree of difficulty, so to speak, in understanding the West than, say, in understanding our next units on the history of the city in the Gilded Age, because there's not as much mythology, there's not as much sort of over dramatization of the of that aspect of our history. So we have to be careful for this of this. The conflict with Native Americans that, of course, have been going on since the beginnings of English colonies and European colonies in the New World continue to pace before, during, and after the Civil War. And one of the most horrifying events took place in the middle of the Civil War and took place in the West. Part of what we'll see happening here more than once is that those battles over resources that we talked about being fought out in courtrooms were sometimes fought out on battlefields or just open fields because gold is discovered in the Black Hills of Colorado and other places as well, and oftentimes on lands that had been set aside as reservations for Native Americans. But once gold is found, white settlers usually didn't care that they were, putting down roots, in a on reservation territory. They were there to make money and weren't going to be pushed away. And Native Americans sometimes, understandably, tried to push them away, and things got violent. So in the middle of the Civil War, sure enough, gold had been discovered there. More and more white colonists, American colonists, were kind of coming into the territory, and there was a great deal of animosity back and forth. A guy named Colonel John Shivington, who presided over the Sand Creek Massacre, the commander of the Colorado Territorial Militia, kind of like a state National Guard unit, but even more informal than that. He told his men before the massacre, "Kill all the Indians you come across. Nits make lice." Meaning, if we wipe them out all now, we don't have to sort of deal with later generations and children. Kill everybody. Take no prisoners. He's basically saying. The Native American, I'm not going to go into kind of the things that led up to the Sand Creek Massacre for reasons of time, but the leader of this particular Native American band, Black Kettle, actually raised the white flag when he saw Shivington's troops coming, which was just ignored, and the force proceeded to butcher 270 Native Americans, most of them women and children. One eyewitness, and if violent wording isn't something you want to hear, then just skip this part of it. But we do sometimes have to get to the gruesome realities in history to understand how serious things are. One eyewitness said, "I saw 5 squaws under a bank for shelter. when the troops came up to them, and they ran out and showed their persons to let the soldiers know they were squaws and begged for mercy. The soldiers shot them all. There were some 30 or 40 squaws collected in a hole for protection. They sent out a little girl about 6 years old with a white flag on a stick. She had not proceeded but a few steps when she was shot and killed. I saw quite a number of infants killed in their mother's arms. Everyone I saw was dead. Everything I saw dead was scalped. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child. I saw one whose privates had been cut out. In many instances, bodies were mutilated in the most horrible manner. Excuse me, I had to take a sip. There we go. My voice is giving out here. This was an outright massacre. There weren't even many warriors there. It was mostly women, children, and old people here. So the event set off a war, it says at the bottom, that lasted for a decade. The Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux were all involved in it. H.W. Brands, who I'll be quoting a lot in his brand new book, On the West, said in early 1865 the Allies attacked the town of Julesburg, meaning the Native American allies I just mentioned, killing all the settlers they could find, scalping the dead, and burning the buildings. They cut the telegraph wire and closed the road to Denver, isolating the territorial capital and threatening it in the middle of winter with starvation. So in the middle of the American Civil War, with westward expansion going on and people getting gold fever, and sort of with that get-rich-quick mentality that we already noted, it puts extra pressure on Native American lands, Native American culture, and so forth. And so our look at relations between Native Americans in the West and the U.S. government starts, at least our look at it, starts right about the beginnings of the Gilded Age, and will end near the end of the Gilded Age with a similar massacre. So I've kind of bookended at least this part of the unit with two massacres that are separated by about 35 years. But this is an atrocity, big time. By the way, in something that one scholar has called the sympathy gradient, which meant that he noticed when poring over the evidence, primary source documents, in this case newspapers, that in general, newspapers that were published closer to the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado tended to be supportive of what the soldiers did. I mean, you just saw the quote. There's many more like that, supportive of what they did. But the further east you got, say all the way back to the East Coast, New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, the big cities in the East, the more critical the newspapers became of what the soldiers and Shivington here had done. It makes some sense because whoever's fault it was, if there's fault, and most historians, I would agree, think it's primarily whites' fault. Native Americans are just defending their land. But regardless of that, whosever fault it is or was, the white settlers living out there, of course, aren't going to see it that way because they're, in great fear. If they own a farm or live in a small town, they're not going to be thinking about the, cause and effect and who's to blame. Which shouldn't surprise us. I'm not saying it's right, but it shouldn't surprise us that closer to Colorado and in Colorado, people tended to support this, incredibly brutal massacre. The reservation system, which you've probably heard something, know something about, was a kind of step in the process of what sometimes is called the Indian question. How do we deal with Native Americans when it's clear that the United States sort of wants to do something with all or most of the land in the American West, and this map really is what was seen as the West at the time. I know much of that we consider to be the Great Plains, not the West, even a little bit on the right side, Illinois, Wisconsin, the Midwest. But all that territory was still, in a sense, the West in those days, not just California and Oregon and, say, Arizona. And you see a number of places there in purple where major battles took place, even after the reservations were already in place, partly because the reservations were already in place. The reservation system was an attempt to try to de-escalate conflict between Americans and the U.S. government and military on one side and Native Americans on the other. The battles, little splotches you see there, show that it didn't entirely work. Native Americans weren't wild, go figure, about being forced onto reservation land that was set aside for them, making it even more difficult for Native Americans and egregious as far as sort of, again, looking at blame here. It happened again and again where a reservation was set aside and the Native American leaders of that group, the Navajo or the Sioux or the Cherokee, would agree, however reluctantly, to go onto the reservation. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. But even when they agreed, they'd often find out after the fact that the U.S. government violates the treaty, violates the agreement, and takes some of the reservation land. It's like, wait a minute. The deal was if we accept your offer here or threat to go onto the reservation, we'll at least get to keep that land and won't be bothered after that. That's right. But it almost never worked out that way because resources or something valuable would be found, something that we could do, something that Americans could do with the land individually as a society that was productive would get in the way. And Native Americans again and again and again saw treaties and agreements broken. I mean, consistently broken. Professor Rourke says, poverty and starvation stalked the reservations. Confined by armed force, the Indians eked out an existence on stingy government rations. These once proud peoples found themselves dependent on government handouts and the assistance of Indian agents who, in the words of one Native American activist of the time, did nothing but fill their own pockets. Indian reservations closely resembled colonial societies where native populations ruled by outside bureaucrats saw their culture assaulted, their religious practices outlawed, their children sent away to school, and their life attacked in the name of progress and civilization. Harsh words from Professor Rourke, but they are indeed apt. So not one of the more proud moments in our history, to be sure. A group, or it was kind of a set of groups that became known kind of under the umbrella title of Friends of the Indian. These were white, usually middle-class reformers, some of them missionaries, not all, but some of them, who believed that this was best for Native Americans because the reservations would be classrooms of civilization, as one put it. Classrooms of civilization. They meant they meant schools in part, but that they meant that the whole experience of reservation life would be a classroom, it'd be like a textbook for learning civilization. And just that phrase itself, of course, tells us that there's racism and or elitism here, at the very least elitism, but probably both, because if you're saying that these are going to be classrooms of civilization, the reservation territory, you're implying that Native Americans aren't civilized at the present. They'll only be civilized once we get them to agree to go on the reservations, and they're there for a time. And once the classrooms of civilization kind of kick in, so there's a great deal of prejudice toward Native Americans. By the way, however, there were probably not the majority But there were a larger number of white Americans than you may think who, for a long time, had opposed the cruelty to Native Americans, the taking of their land, the destruction of their cultures, going all the way back to before the Civil War. The now defunct Whig Party, it was part of the two-party system for a while, but that party died off. Their opponents, the Democrats, lived on, but they did not. But many, not all, but many Whig leaders for a long time had been maybe they were using it as a political issue, as politicians are prone to doing. Nonetheless, had been pretty vocal in opposition to policies, of the U.S. government designed to and inclined to follow through in taking Native American lands from them. You have split my land, and I don't like it, as one chief said after the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. There are two Fort Laramie treaties. We're going to deal with both of them, so keep them straight. 1851 and 1868. From I think this is H.W. Brand's book called El Dorado. Again, a new history of the West. The In 1851 at Fort Laramie on the North Platte River, more than 12,000 Indians stood witness as the leaders of the Sioux, Northern Cheyennes, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboines, Mandans, Arikaras granted the U.S. the right to establish posts and roads across the plains in exchange for the guarantee of annuities compensating them for the loss of game, meaning buffalo and other game that was a huge part of their way of life and their subsistence. In 1853, the tribes of the Southern Plains, including the Southern Cheyennes, Comanches, Kiowas, agreed to similar provisions. The Americans also pressed the Plains nomads, like hunter-gatherer types, to agree to territorial boundaries, hinting at the reservation system that would become the hallmark of federal Indian policy in the years to come. But the lines on a map were meaningless for people whose way of life required them to cultivate or circulate within huge territories in pursuit of buffalo, and Indians chafed at the idea of territorial restriction. So the Fort Laramie Treaty, this one in 1851, was an attempt by the U.S. government to create this sort of huge reservation territory and use it to essentially keep a number of tribes sort of in one place, and so they could, continue with the business of going from sea to shining sea and taking sort of land around all the land around and beyond the reservation. But even from the start here, we see that Native Americans, to say that they chafed at this it might be an understatement, and sometimes they're willing eventually to go to war in opposition to this, especially when the U.S. government violated, its agreements, violated its sort of terms of a contract or a treaty. A death wind for my people. The disappearance, as one Native American leader called it, the disappearance of the bison, buffalo. This was already being, there's some, I think, controversy over this today. Scholars in different fields sometimes have different ways of seeing it. But it does, I think, it is pretty clear that the buffalo had already sort of hit upon hard times. It wasn't just whites coming out and shooting them in hunting expeditions, or the U.S. government shooting them in hunting expeditions. U.S. military deliberately to deprive the Plains Indians who relied on the buffalo, like the Sioux, for food to attack their food supply. All that was true, and it certainly contributed. It may have been the final, the final straw for the buffalo, the bison. Nonetheless, there were environmental factors that had nothing to do with white people shooting lots of buffalo for no reason much of the time, or no good reason. So this, it's a combination of things. Nonetheless, you can see just from that awful pile of skulls of buffalo that many were killed. Part of it also came because buffalo hides for a time. This was mostly before the Civil War, just before our period that we're studying in this class. Buffalo hide turned into buffalo robes were in huge demand in Europe. They became very trendy and fashionable, so it drove the sort of the buffalo trapping, or I guess hunting industry. Buffalo pelts and hides were of great value, and Native Americans sometimes were involved in that trade as well. So it's not just it's not true to say, hey, the white man killed all the buffalo. It's certainly partially true, and it's disgusting to behold. But nature played its part. Native Americans played their part to some degree as well. Also, Native Americans' use of the horse, which was an invaluable technological advantage. Now, I'm not saying horses are technology per se, but we should think of them as such to understand this. Right? It's transportation technology. It's the horse, in a sense, is a military vehicle, like a tank. So this technological arrival after Columbus and the Spanish, which eventually transformed some of these Native American groups, like the Sioux, on the plains lifestyle. The horse became an integral part of the Sioux lifestyle and other groups on the plains as well. But when those horses were introduced and then bred, and the population took off because the Sioux and Cheyennes and others wanted them to, because they were so useful, the buffalo for the first time had a competitor species, and they didn't necessarily do that well. Diseases brought by such animals transferred from horses to bison that they had no immunity for. We know that story, sadly, already. So again, I'm not denying that white Americans played a role in destroying the buffalo, which is incredibly distasteful to have to think about. They did, but it was a bit more complicated than that.